Welcome. We're going to be talking about spontaneous generation in this video, and my guests who would like to learn about spontaneous generation are Marissa. She loves learning about new things. I've got Zally, my zombie, who also is interested. Hi there. Yeah, I don't actually know how to talk weird. So these are all my friends trying to make the video a little bit more exciting, okay? And we're going to be doing, I'm going to be talking about spontaneous generation in this video, and then when I'm done, you're going to have to answer a few questions about the different individuals who were either supporting spontaneous generation or who did not agree with spontaneous generation. And so we're detracting from it or trying to come up with a different idea that might answer the same questions. So the idea of spontaneous generation, life comes from non-life, has been around since really old times, like BC times. Aristotle is one of the first that was actually recorded in stating that life comes from non-life. And so he was supporting the spontaneous generation movement. And from there, we had most of our churches, most of our scientists all believed that this idea of spontaneous generation was irrefutable. So if someone gets sick, well, they obviously did something that caused them to get sick. There was no such thing as microbes back then. If animals showed up, well, they obviously came from the wheat or the dirty linens that were in your grain basement. So these are the ideas of what spontaneous generation was, or these are the reasons spontaneous generation was so thought as truth. But then in the 1600s, this scientist, Reedy, came along and he said, no, I don't really think that spontaneous generation is correct. I think there's something else happening. What was that, Zally? Oh, you want to know what he did? He actually came up with and so Zally's here, so I'm actually talking to her too. He came up with this really awesome experiment. He took different containers. So he used 3 jars that he could seal completely and 3 jars that he left opened. The 3 jars that he sealed, he placed raw meat in. The 3 jars that he left open, he placed the same type of raw meat in. And he let them sit. In the 3 jars that were sealed, no maggots, nothing came about, nothing grew. But in the 3 jars that were opened, within days, there were maggots. And people were like, well, there's life on those. And he said, yeah, but did you see all the flies flying around? Those flies were laying eggs, and those eggs turned into maggots when they hatched. And that's what happened. And people were like, no, no, no. He said, look, the ones that are sealed have no maggots. How can you not agree? Obviously, flies landed, laid eggs, and produced the maggots. And they said, no, there's something in the air. You're not letting any air get to these 3 pieces of meat. There's some vital force in the air that has to get there for life to form. And so he had come up with a great experiment to refute spontaneous generation and to support biogenesis, but it wasn't enough. So Reedy went back to the drawing board and came up with another experiment. He said, you want air to get in? Fine, I'll give you air. And he took a mesh covering, kind of like cheesecloth, if you've ever seen cheesecloth. He put meat into 3 jars, and then he covered each of those jars with cheesecloth. This was a barrier that flies could not get into the meat, but the same flies, but air, fresh air, could actually go into and hit the meat. And at that point, they were like, whoa, okay. Now he's getting air. And so he really stirred up the supporters of spontaneous generation. They were really like blown away. What is going on? And so now they're stressing out because this is something that they've believed all their life. It'd be like us believing that, so-and-so is your parent and then finding out it's not. That would be like, right? Whoa, what's going on? The world is totally changing. Well, that's what was happening in the world because of Reedy's experiment. So people started thinking maybe the little microscopic animals, bacteria, that Leeuwenhoek found were simple enough to be formed by spontaneous generation, but larger life forms were formed in a different way. And a lot of people said, no, 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 no. And so spontaneous generation, I won't say that, I'll say scientists decided to start running tests to see if microbes would grow. And Needham was one of the first individuals to determine if microbes would grow. And so what he did, John Needham, in 1745, he boiled a chicken broth infusion. He heated it up so there was no life at all. And then he poured them into flasks, cooled the solution, and found life teeming in them. And he said, okay, there was no life initially because I boiled the infusions, and now there's life. So life comes from non-life. So Lazzaro Spallanzani said, I don't think so. I think that you didn't do the experiment properly. This is 20 years after. So Needham did this in 1745. So this is about in the 1760s. And what he did was he boiled broth, but then he covered or sealed the flasks once he boiled them. And there was no growth, no life. Well, of course, the scientific community, the majority of people said, vital force, need to have air, need to be able to breathe. There's something in the air that is allowing these animalcules to be formed from non-life. So Spallanzani kind of was his experiments were wiped out. They said, nope, your experiments aren't that important because you didn't allow the vital force. And what they determined the vital force was oxygen. So Laurent Lavoisier had determined that oxygen in the air was the vital force, which oxygen is needed for a huge amount of living organisms. That being said, not all microbes need oxygen. And so this is in the 1700s. Spontaneous generation is still the main theory of where life comes from, for at least now the smaller microorganisms, those simple life forms. But then in the mid-1800s, Rudolf Virchow proposed a new theory, the theory of biogenesis. Life comes from life. So only living things can produce new living things. What? Nuh-uh. So basically, this is one of those cell theory models, right? And people did not want to believe it. But in the mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur was around, and he was this awesome scientist that did all kinds of things, probably the most famous for his pasteurization, which is named for him. But one of the things that he did was he proved the theory of biogenesis and disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. What he did was he took a swan neck flask, and that swan neck flask was used to prove that even with air getting in, microbes cannot grow. They come from the air. What? Oh, Marissa wants to know how he figured this out. Well, initially, he noticed that if he boiled infusions, chicken or beef infusions, and let them sit in the open air, microbes would be teeming in there. And he thought, okay, that's kind of strange. So if he left the infusions, or if he covered the infusions, then no microbes were growing. And he thought, okay, this is really interesting. So I wonder, he then took and he used a cotton ball that he put into the neck of a flask, and he basically poured material over that cotton ball, and he boiled the infusions. Nothing was growing inside, but when he examined the cotton ball a few days later, he noticed that there were little animalcules, and he was like, oh, these animalcules came from the air, because there was nothing in the broth when he poured it in, and there was nothing in the broth after he boiled it, but there was stuff on the cotton. So they had to have been filtered from the air. And so at this point, he then made this flask. So we have our little flask, but now instead of the neck just being a straight up and down neck, we have this neck that bends around. So it's like the swan neck flask. It's actually called a swan neck flask. And what he did was he used that swan neck flask. He put broth in. He boiled the broth. He then allowed the broth to sit. And no matter how long he let the broth sit, so long as the broth stayed in the bottle and didn't get into the neck, it seemed to be fine. But air was able to go all the way through. If he tipped the flask and then turned it back over where the broth could get into the neck and then go back in, then bacteria or microbes would grow. If he broke the neck of the flask off so that air could go right in, bacteria grew. But so long as that didn't happen, nothing grew. He disproved spontaneous generation.